What are the key trends in inequality? Let's look at income inequality within countries. What do we mean by income? Well, market income is anything that you earn in the market, basically from wages, businesses, investments. Disposable income is that income left over after taxes and adding any transfers that you receive, for instance, Social Security payments from the government, etc. So you can see in all three countries noted here, US, Sweden, and Japan, the wealth inequality is pretty high, much more than the income or earnings inequality. And then in all three cases, redistribution is happening because you see in the darker red right bar, the Gini coefficient, which measures inequality, is lower than either the wealth or the earnings. So something is happening to redistribute away from the wealthy towards the lower income people. And now let's look at between countries. So there are cross-country differences, right? No countries are the same, but there were some common trends, especially prior to 1980. After 1980, things diverged for many countries. Specifically, the countries grouped on the left there experienced rising inequality after the 80s, while it sort of leveled out for all the countries shown on the right. And of course, prior to the 1980s, all countries shown on both sides were experiencing drops in inequality. And what about Earth overall? Global inequality, on the blue line, the Gini coefficient is measured for the entire world. And in the red line, if everyone in the country earned the average income, that's what the hypothetical Gini line would be. So since 1980, you see between country inequality has rapidly fallen, but within country inequality has increased, but on net, global inequality has begun to decline. So we want to dig a little bit into what is causing the rise in inequality within countries, and a lot of it is having to do with the changing distribution of jobs. So you can see a hollowing out of jobs in the middle. The traditional blue-collar manufacturing, relatively high-wage jobs are disappearing, and you're getting service jobs which are both high-paying and low-paying on the rise. How can we categorize the different types of inequality? One way to think about it is inequality that's due to something outside of your control, a category you're in, a gender, an age, a skin color, accidents of birth, country of citizenship, etc. If those are the best explanation for inequality, usually people are not as comfortable with that. We tend to be a little bit more comfortable in earnings inequality that's down to education, and you can see that in here too. There are both gender and education reasons for inequality. Another thing that usually people want to know and want to think about is, well, inequality exists, but is social mobility possible? And the answer to that is, let's measure intergenerational inequality, the extent to which differences in parental generations are passed on to the next generation. In other words, how strong is that intergenerational transmission process? So here's some data. On the vertical axis, the proportion of the children in this earnings quintile whose income or whose placement is conditional on father's earning quintile. So of the poorest 20%, that fifth of all Americans, we're looking at the US here, in the poorest 20%, about 40% of youngsters ended up there, and their father's earnings were there also. So they're sort of following in their father's footsteps, if you will. And likewise, you get another big chunk here where the richest 20% of children, 36% of them's parents' fathers were also in that quintile. Where you don't get much is kids who were in the richest and then end up in the poorest, or were in the poorest and end up in the richest. In other words, accidents of birth or your family's wealth is pretty important to explaining what your income's going to be. And just to clear the record, it's often brought up about inequality and incentives and economic growth, but overall it appears to be no real correlation between growth and the level of inequality. So you can see average inequality is somewhat correlated with GDP negatively. So the higher the inequality, the lower the GDP over here. And in rich countries, it's not very necessarily clear. So what are some of the pathways that might explain that divergence from the simple narrative that more inequality in free market capitalist countries yields more economic growth because it makes people work harder? Well, so if we don't see that playing out in the data, what possibly could be at work here? Well, maybe there's more cooperation and trust, and that is what's necessary in advanced, modern, specialized free market economies. Policies that enhance the endowments of the poor often improve productivity, give them an incentive to try harder because they have more access, right? If you're poor and you have no hope of getting ahead, there's not much to incentivize you. And there's less money wasted on guards and fences and gates keeping each other away, keeping the large homes away from the people that have nothing.